I'm Richard Taylor from Marquette University, and together with my colleague at the Catholic University of Leuven, Professor Andrea Robilio, we present you these lectures on Thomas Aquinas on the nature and attainment of happiness. This is a lecture for Class 8. Class 8 is on Averroes and Augustine on ultimate happiness. This video is 8A on Averroes. Let's proceed. In what follows here, I'm going to do this. First, I'm going to provide an overview or brief account of the unique doctrine of intellect found in the mature work of Averroes. That is, the doctrine on the separate or material receptive intellect and the separate agent intellect. Number two, I will then turn to his mature long commentary on the Metaphysics of Aristotle, Book Lamb, for consideration of the issue of ultimate happiness and knowing separate substances, or knowing things that are separate. That's a better way to put it. Finally, I will explicate some very difficult passages in his long commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle, in which Averroes discusses human intellect and ultimate human fulfillment, or happiness. What's going to be quite interesting about this is that this understanding in the long commentary on the De Anima was systematically misunderstood by the Latin tradition, which created out of what they had of Averroes a very special misinterpretation. Misinterpretation that became characteristic of Latin Averroism, an interpretation intolerable in the context of European medieval Christianity. That interpretation held that human beings, through just intellectual activity and without religion, without scripture, without divine guidance, one might say, could attain highest fulfillment, just intellectually highest fulfillment, in knowing separate substances, uniting with them, perhaps uniting even with God. And that's a misinterpretation of Averroes, a radical one, quite radical one, but we need to be aware of it because that's going to be something that Aquinas combats in certain ways. But we'll see more of that later on. Let's proceed for now. Pardon me. First of all, Averroes' cognitive psychology. First, he has the primary principles, and these are the notions of intellectual understanding that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. These are called primary principles. These come to human beings from the agent intellect. Now, other elements, sense perception, which is the source of intellectual knowledge. That's the starting point. So a human being has sense perception, apprehends things. The things apprehended through the various senses are unified by an internal part of the cognitive apparatus of the brain called the common sense. The common sense then outputs an image, and that image is in the imagination. So imagination is the receptive subject of images, or what will later be called phantasms in Latin. Cogitation then has access to these images, and cogitation is the human brain power for stripping down particular images to what is essential to the particular thing apprehended via the image. Namely, differences in hair color are not essential, perhaps skin color is not essential, and other things are not essential in determining what it is to be a human being. But still, these remain particulars. So the stripped down particular then is placed in memory, the human brain power, which receives the stripped down particular image. Intellectual abstraction of the intelligible in act then comes from the contents of memory. These contents are intelligible in potency, not in act. And memory in this case is in the brain. The requirements of intellectual abstraction are the following. First of all, immateriality. Intelligibles in act are not particulars and not material. Next, hence they require an immaterial receptive subject into which they can be received. This is the so-called material or receptive intellect. Now this subject cannot be, notice this carefully, the subject cannot be a determinate particular entity, since were that so, says Averroes, when the intelligible in potency is received into the subject as intelligible in act, it would be particularized by the particular subject. And then it would no longer be an intelligible in act, which is universal. Consequently, the receiving material subject, which is immaterial, must not be a determinate particular, but rather has to be the unique intellect which does not contract the intelligible in act into particularity. So it's a unique entity into which the intelligibles are received. Those intelligibles will be shared by all human beings, but we'll be coming to that shortly. But the point is, it has the set of intelligibles brought about through abstraction. Hence, this material intellect for Averroes, the material intellect into which intelligibles in act are received, is unique in its nature and is not a member of the species. It is the unique intellect shared by all human beings who share the intersubjective discourse and common science that human beings have. This is because there can only be one set of intelligibles in act for all human beings, so that we can have intersubjective discourse and common science. Now, the abstraction which results in the intelligible in act to be available to individual human knowers is made possible by the separating, abstracting, or transferring power of the agent intellect. This intellect is supposed to exist since its abstracting or intellectualizing power is required to bring about the existence of the intelligible in act. So its existence is posited in order to explain how it is that human beings have knowledge, a knowledge which is in some way the apprehension of the intelligible in act. The material intellect is able to apprehend an intelligible when it is made to receive the intelligible in act. This is like light in Aristotelian physics, which makes the medium, air, actually transparent and thereby enables things to be seen. And those things then, once light is made transparent, the images of things can come into, can be received in human beings. So this is a necessary principle involved here, a necessary condition. Now, note that there are two factors in one act here for the Aristotelian physics of perception. One, the potentially transparent medium, air, requires two, light from the sun or another source to make it actually transparent. In consequence of which, three, a sensible thing is seen. So analogously, the potentially knowing material intellect requires two, the intellectualizing power of the agent intellect to abstract or transfer, three, the intelligible in potency from the mode of being of a particular to the mode of being of intelligible in act. And for Averroes, this takes place by willing human action, since it is we who go from not knowing to knowing. These are then called voluntary intelligibles because they come about through our efforts and by our will. The intelligible act is only shared by those human beings who have had their own experience of the relevant particulars and have abstracted the relevant intelligible in act. After the intelligible in act has been abstracted, this brings about in the human knower what is called the theoretical intellect. This is the result of the act of intellection carried out. As an acquired intellect, a reconnection with the set of intelligibles in the material intellect is made easy by this new disposition in the individual human being, a disposition for reconnecting. However, in this account, the human agent wills via the cogitative power in the physical brain, wills to know. But since the intelligibles in act are immaterial, they cannot be located in the physical cogitative power of the individual human knower. Rather, they are a unique set of intelligibles that must be in the unique material intellect shared by all human beings. In this, the agent intellect functions only as an enabling intellectual power of abstraction. It is in itself always in act, since it is immaterial and without potency, writes Averroes. It knows nothing of the things of the world, since it has no receptive power. The material intellect is both intellect and also receptive to the highest degree, since all that exists is knowable in the Aristotelian tradition. Now, Averroes recognized these seemingly contradictory characteristics, namely immaterial intellect really or actually existing as such, namely as intellect, but still being essentially receptivity. But of course it can't be that, because if it's intellect, it's actual. It's actual and it has no matter. But I go on. But Averroes found no other way to resolve the issues involved. This has to do with the way he set up the problem and how he solved the issue. So, as I've often said in class, getting the questions right is essential, and then we can work on answering them. But Averroes made certain moves that set up the questions in a certain way, and he then found the way to resolve those questions, and that is with his doctrine of the separate material intellect. He is unique in the tradition in putting forward the notion of a single, separate, and shared intellect for all human beings, namely immaterial intellect. It was common to the tradition to say that there is an agent intellect shared by all human beings. So Averroes allowed the view that this epistemologically required potency exists in the material intellect, and he knew he was doing something radical and different. This is what allows for there to be a unity of intelligibles as reference, as universals, for intersubjective discourse in science, as I said earlier. Now, more on the cognitive psychology then. The nature of the material intellect is to receive and to be actualized to account for the knowing of things of the world as proper objects of knowing, that is, as immaterial intelligibles in act. It knows the things of the world, the things here, through abstractions impressed upon it by the agent intellect only. There's nothing else that it can know. It's only a principle set up to account for actual human knowing. Both the agent intellect and the material intellect should be looked upon here in Averroes as key principles required for the solving of the noetic problems that of the Aristotelian tradition, how it is that human beings come to have intellectual understanding. The nature and function of the agent intellect itself is twofold. First, to provide human beings with first principles of understanding, which we've already seen. And second, it is the actualizing power for the formation of intelligibles in act. It has no further function. I want to stress that. It has no further function. It does not emanate intelligibles from itself, nor does it receive intelligibles, as I said in a previous slide, because it has no receptivity. It has no potentiality as such. The nature of the material intellect, on the other hand, is to receive and to be actualized to account for knowing of things of the world as proper objects of intellectual knowing, that is, as immaterial intelligibles in act. It knows the things of the world, the things here, through abstractions impressed upon it by the agent intellect only. Now let's turn, I guess I was repeating myself. Okay, so now let's turn to the mature commentary on the Metaphysics of Aristotle. So here we're concerned with metaphysics, Aristotle's Metaphysics 1072b4, with lambda of metaphysics. This is Averroes text 38, and it concerns the nature of the necessary first principle on which motion ultimately depends. But Averroes cites another translation, and he offers these following comments. Quote, here's the other translation. It is on such a principle, then, that the heaven and nature depend. We enjoy something like a happy state for a short time. Close quote. So it's a bit of a corrupt translation he's got here, but he makes use of it. And he explains as following. He says Aristotle, means, it is evident that the heaven and nature are in contact with a principle which is an intellect in the highest state of pleasure, happiness, and bliss, similar to our own state of contact for a short time with the intellect which is our principle, close quote. Now, the point here is that in the heavens are in touch with the final cause of all, a separate intellect according to a series of separate intellects according to Aristotle, and that intellect, that highest intellect, is in the highest state of pleasure, happiness, and bliss, as it says here. And he's explicating Aristotle, and that's the sort of thing that Aristotle does say. Now, however, let's look closely at what Averroes says and what follows. He says then, quote, he continues this and says, quote, then Aristotle says, this, quote, this state belongs to it eternally, but for us it is not possible, close quote. He means, says Averroes, this contact with this principle of the heaven and this link with it is eternal for it. So for the celestial bodies and celestial movers, that is an eternal connection in final causality, as Aristotle said, in a kind of love that causes motion, but a love for the first principle. But Averroes goes on here, but our contact with the principle which is in us cannot be eternal, because that part of us which is united is subject to generation and corruption, whereas the part of the celestial body which is united is eternal. Close quote. So this point is this. The account that is given by Aristotle indicates that the celestial body is united to something higher, and that higher thing, which has pure actuality, God, then has the highest happiness, highest fulfillment, highest pleasure, as Aristotle himself remarks in the Metaphysics. But Averroes is very clear here about the perishability of the individual human being, and he speaks of the principle in us by means of which we have knowledge. And that principle in us will be the principles of the material intellect and the agent intellect. But we cannot be eternal, because the part of us that is connected with it, this is going to be the brain powers of cogitation and memory. Those are in a corruptible and generable substance, namely our bodies. So there's no personal immortality here. And take special note, ultimate happiness for a human being who is subject to generation and corruption is to have knowledge in this world. There is no afterlife for Averroes. He continues then in his quotation, it clearly appears from that Aristotle thinks that happiness for men qua men consists in this contact with the intellect, which has been shown in the De Anima to be principal, mover, and agent for us. In other words, our contact with the separate intellects, agent intellect and material intellect. He goes on, the separate intellects, qua separate, must be principle of that of which they are principle in both senses, both as movers and as ends. So we seek after the immateriality and fulfillment and knowing that is found, and perfect actuality that is found in the agent intellect and the material intellect, and that those are ends for us, but those are also movers, because our participation or sharing of them as powers enables us to have knowledge by our will, recall, and what we said before. Continuing then, the quotation from the Metaphysics, commentary on the Metaphysics, quote, the active intellect, insofar as it is separate and principal for us, must move us in the same way as the beloved moves the lover. And if every motion must be in contact with the thing which produces it as end, we must ultimately be in contact with this separate intellect, so that we depend on such a principle on which the heaven depends. As Aristotle says, although this happens to us but for a short time. Again, we're in contact with a separate intellect, but it's only in the context of this life, and it's only for intellectual understanding. That's extremely important here. And the end is to have the actualization, the sort of actuality that the agent intellect has in this. But again, this happens for us for only a short time, namely in this life, in this perishable body. So let's now look at the long commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle. It's a rather challenging work, but there's some key passages here that we need to look at, and it'll prove to be quite valuable for what we're doing. Now, I'm going to start with, from the readings that were provided to you, I'm going to start with page 388. The issue under discussion there is the material or receptive intellect and whether it understands separate things. Ibn Bajjah, or Avampace, thinks a human intellect, predecessor of Averroes, thinks a human intellect uses abstraction to gain knowledge through higher and higher abstractions, eventually conjoining with the separate agent intellect in a noetic identity. So it joins with the separate intellect, and through that conjoining, it knows all things. Here, though, abstractive knowledge is for the purpose of conjoining, as I indicated earlier. Averroes here is concerned with the question of human conjoining with separate substances too. But he rejects this sort of thing that Ibn Bajjah is doing. We don't do all of this abstractive ability for the purpose of uniting and conjoining with the separate agent intellect. Rather, the separate intellect, conjoining with the separate intellects, makes abstractive knowledge possible. So as far as Averroes is concerned, Ibn Bajjah has the whole notion upside down. So here Averroes is concerned with human conjoining with separate substances, but it's going to be a completely different kind of conjoining. The end is not conjoining. Conjoining is merely a tool for the sake of abstractive knowledge, and knowledge is the end. And knowledge is fulfillment of human beings, and knowledge is happiness. But it's knowledge only during this life, because this is the life here on earth that human beings have, a perishable. And the separate substances he talks about are connecting with or conjoining with. Well, yes, we would be connecting with them, but they are the separate agent intellect and separate material intellect, principles put forward to explain the nature of human intellectual understanding. This whole issue, though, is part of what's found in the last lines of Aristotle's De Anima 3.7, or Book 3, Chapter 7, where he raises the issue of whether human beings can apprehend separate things while here in the body. This is a very problematic question to figure out the question here. Modern interpreters tend to look at this as a continuation of a discussion of mathematics. But ancient and medieval commentators quite often, not usually, regarded this as a reference to a doctrine that Aristotle never completed. And it raises the question of whether we, while in the body, can really know separate things. That is, and it's put forward as, can we really know separate intellects and separate substances, which would ultimately be our happiness? So is happiness possible for us while we're in the body? That's the kind of interpretation of the question that was given. And of course, the response for Averroes is going to be that the only happiness available to us is in the body during our lives here. Other philosophers, though, will say that one can live on in a higher way thanks to the material intellect. Here Averroes raises the issue and writes the following, quote, if it is in the nature of the material intellect that it understands separate things, again, this is the issue of De Anima 3.7, it is necessary that it be understanding them always in the future and in the past. It is thought, therefore, that it follows upon this position that as soon as the material intellect is conjoined with us, the agent intellect too is conjoined with us, which is unthinkable and contrary to what people assert. This is completely contrary to the tradition, he says. So that is, everyone says that the agent intellect is a separate substance, and some people think that as soon as we have the material intellect, the agent intellect is conjoined to us as well, and in that way we have knowledge. But this is what Averroes calls unthinkable. It's ridiculous. Otherwise, we would all have knowledge all the time in this, but there's all kinds of other difficulties would ensue. Now, in the assigned readings, Averroes goes through the teachings of Ibn Bajjah and Alexander of Aphrodisias, and then on page 390, the issue of how the immaterial and eternal agent intellect can be in a perishable human intellect. Notice the word in here can mean various things. Obviously, it's a physical notion of something being in something, but it's usually being used to describe an immaterial relation. So it's going to be an extended sense. He says, quote, how is the agent intellect's proper action, which is to make intelligibles, ascribed to a generable and corruptible intellect, namely what is in a positive disposition? That is the disposition in us. How could it be that in us when we are generable and corruptible? He says, unless perhaps one asserts that the intellect which is in a positive disposition, this is the intellectus in habitu, or hexis, the intellect that's been disposed and has knowledge, we've already done the abstraction, it's there. Unless perhaps one asserts that the intellect which is in a positive disposition is the agent intellect in composition with the material intellect, as Themistius says, or asserts that the final form belonging to us by which we separate the intelligibles and understand is composed of the intellect which is in a positive disposition and the agent intellect, as Alexander and Ibn Bajjah assert, and we also figured to be apparent from the account of Aristotle. So there's going to be a conjoining. When we know there's going to be a conjoining, and then conjoining is when we conjoin and make use of the power of the agent intellect to do the abstraction, and then we receive it into the separate material intellect. But the problem is as follows, and I'm now at 390 at the top, page 390. Quote, even if we had asserted this to be so, nothing would result from the perfection of this activity of creating intelligibles except the perfection of the activity of understanding these things, not the perfection of the activity of understanding separate things. For it is impossible that understanding these be ascribed to generation or to coming to be by some generated being, for instance, coming to be by the intellect, which is in a positive disposition, except accidentally. And if it were not so, then the generable will be made eternal, as we said. Now, the problem here. The issue is how the eternal intellect can be in us who are generable and perishable. How then, he says, how then is the eternal in composition with the corruptible in such a way that there comes to be from them one activity? The answer to this, and the answer to the question of the possibility of conjoining with separate substances in ultimate happiness, are these. 1. The individual human knower does not become eternal and fully identical with the eternal immaterial agent intellect. Rather, we share in its power. Now remember, he's putting forward this doctrine in order to explain how individual human beings come to have knowledge, even though individual human beings are perishable and corruptible entities that come into existence and go out of existence. Number 2, conjoining with the material intellect and the agent intellect is only, I stress that only, in dealing with the issue of the thinking of intelligibles, those intelligibles called theoretical intelligibles, through intellectual abstraction. There is a noetic identity in the abstracted theoretical intelligibles apprehended by the perishable individual human, in the material intellect thanks to the agent intellect. So the theoretical intellect, or the intellect in a positive disposition, same thing. These, here there is an identity of what's in the individual human being and what was generated by the two separate intellects. But there is no ontological identity with the material, the substance of the material intellect itself, or the agent intellect substance either. Rather, there is a use of the powers of these intellects resulting in a sharing of intelligibles in the material intellect. After going through the issues in greater detail, on page 395 he then writes the following, quote, those then are all the questions arising in this inquiry, and they are as difficult as you see. We must say what has appeared to us to be the case regarding this. Let us say, therefore, the intellect existing in us has two activities insofar as it is ascribed to us. One of the genus of affection, namely understanding, and the other of the genus of activity, namely to extract forms and denude them of matters, which is nothing but making them intelligible in act after they were such in potency. Pardon me. Hence, it is evident that after we have possessed the intellect, which is in a positive disposition, namely we have the theoretical intelligibles, we've come to have knowledge, it is in our will to understand any intelligible we wish and to extract any form we wish. So when we're in that state, we can carry out this intellectual abstraction that makes knowledge possible. So that is, these intellects come to be in us, to be shared by us, and they're available for our use by our will. In another later work, Averroes says that there is a natural affinity and a connection of human beings with these two separate intellects for the end or purpose of human intellectual understanding. On page 397, he writes of natural intelligibles. You recall those are the primary principles of understanding that come from the agent intellect, and the voluntary intelligibles that come about in us by will, that is, by our own efforts at abstraction. He writes the following. The intellect in us, therefore, is composed of the intellect which is in a positive disposition and the agent intellect, either in such a way that the propositions are, as it were, matter, and the agent intellect is, as it were, form, or in such a way that the propositions are, as it were, the instrument, and the agent intellect is, as it were, the efficient cause. The propositions are the understandings that come from consideration of the world, and those it will be abstracted when the actuality of the agent intellect is brought to them. So the two are combined. And the content of sensation, after being processed, as indicated earlier, resulting processed particularly by the cogitative power and then placed into memory, those are the propositions we're talking about here. They are instruments, and the agent intellect is the actualizing efficient cause. Here the term form is being used to mean what is perfecting and actualizing. So the agent intellect plays the role of form here because it actualizes the propositions or what we have from the world as universals or intelligibles in act. At page 399 he explains that the agent intellect comes to be then, as I just said, a perfecting actuality in us for the generation of abstract intelligibles, when he writes the following, quote, "There is no way in which the form is generated in us except that. For when the theoretical intelligibles are united with us through the forms of the imagination," remember that by forms he means the forms were placed in memory through cogitation, and the agent intellect is united with the theoretical intelligibles, but that which apprehends theoretical intelligibles is the same, namely the material intellect, it is necessary that the agent intellect be united with us through the conjoining of the theoretical intelligibles. So there is a uniting and a kind of knowing of separate intellects for Averroes. But only these two intellects, agent intellect and material intellect, which are principles for the formation of abstracted intellectual understanding. He goes on, "It is necessary that the agent intellect be united with us through the conjoining of the theoretical intelligibles. It is evident, then, that when all the theoretical intelligibles exist in us in potency, it will be united with us in potency. When all the theoretical intelligibles exist in us in act, it will be united with us in act. And when certain theoretical intelligibles exist in potency and certain in act, then it will be united in one part and not in another. And then we are said to be moved to conjoining. So we conjoin with it and we have this kind of intellectual understanding." He then continues, quote, and this is a part of the long passage here, but it's quite valuable. "It is evident that when the motion is complete, immediately that intellect will be conjoined with us in all ways. So in the whole process, the separate intellect is conjoined with us. Then it is evident that its relation to us in that disposition is as a relation of the intellect which is in a positive disposition in relation to us." Okay, so the intellect in positive disposition is the actualized knowing in us. "Since it is so, it is necessary that a human being understand all the intelligibles through the intellect proper to him, and that he carry out the activity proper to him in regard to all beings, just as he understands by his proper intellection all the beings through the intellect which is in a positive disposition when it has been conjoined with the forms of the imagination. That is, that separate agent intellect is form for us, it's a power, it's something that belongs to us, it is our intellect, and it's in us, and the uniting is required for the sake of the bringing about of the abstractive knowledge." Finally, he writes this, continuing the same passage, "In this way, therefore, human beings, as Themistius says, are made like unto God, in that he is all beings in a way, and one who knows these in a way, for beings are nothing but his knowledge, and the cause of beings is nothing but his knowledge. How marvelous is that order, and how mysterious is that mode of being! But that's God's mode of being. Ours is to unite with the agent intellect and material intellect in order to have intellectual understanding. And so, in a way, this is wonderful. Themistius, though, had a different doctrine. Themistius thought that the separate intellect came down and guided us in all the abstraction, and that we also had our own individual material intellects. Averroes rejects that for the reasons given earlier. That is, the real nature of human conjunction with separate intellects is nothing but the conjoining with the abstracting agent intellect and the receptive material intellect in the formation of human knowledge. That knowledge is knowledge of theoretical intelligibles or universals, namely the universals of science. All this is an explanation of human scientific knowledge, period. In the Latin tradition, however, this was systematically misread as if Averroes were talking about a conjoining with angels and ultimately with God in a noetic identity yielding an ultimate happiness in a way completely separate from religion. This misinterpretation is called Latin Averroism and was perceived as a powerful threat to the principles of Christianity itself. We'll be getting into that with Aquinas' approach to these issues at a later time, but this is the end of video 8a, and so I'll stop here.